Okay, hi everybody, and welcome. Today we're really excited. We've got a great special guest. We have Chris Ward of IMS Global, and Chris is going to be talking to us about ISO 45001, the new standard for safety management. So enough of the intro. We're excited to have Chris. We really appreciate his time. We think you're going to learn a lot from him. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris. Chris, hello. How are you today?
I'm fine, Jack. Jeff, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this web conference and webinar. Yes, it's a great day here over in the UK, and that it cheers us all up. And we can look to the future in the same way as 45,001 is something for the future.
Well said. Fantastic. Well, let's dive in. And before we start talking about 45,001, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is Chris Ward, and what is your relationship to 45,001?
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, I worked for the UK regulator, the Health and Safety Executive, for almost 40 years. And near the end of my time there, I worked on management systems and helped revise HC's guidance on standards, which was and still is HSG 65. It's used a lot around the world. Many students will know it, and that was the POPMAR system. And after leaving HSE, I started work with the developers of 45,001 in 2013 when it was first muted, because I've been on the British Standards Committee for 18,001 for 10 years now. And so in the early part of 45,001, I attended and helped with some of the drafting, and I've kept an eye on it ever since, and started a LinkedIn group, which became very popular as well.
Great, and that's of course how I originally met you. Okay, next question. Obviously, this interview is to learn about what 45,001 is. It's an ISO standard, so I'll ask it in two parts. For those who don't know, could you explain to people what ISO is? And then could you explain what ISO 45,001 is?
Yes, ISO is the International Standards Organization. It's a charitable institution which creates standards used throughout the world. These standards are voluntary, and they're created and drafted by volunteers. And quite often these volunteers become part of the national standards for particular countries, for their delegates to go and help create the ISO standard. There are, forget the number, there's well over 1,000 standards in play, ranging from product standards to environmental standards. People will be familiar with 14,001. And the organization is based in Switzerland. And quite often what happens with ISO standards is the national standards bodies for the particular countries, ANSI in the US or BSI in the UK, will adopt the ISO standard to make it their own national standard. And in doing so, they have to keep the standard very much as it is, although there may be some sort of individual variations for countries' requirements. Now, 45,001 is the first global occupational health and safety management standard. And in 2013, the delegates to ISO had been identifying increasing pressures from around the world to have a unified management system. USA had their own, Australia had their own, together with New Zealand, and Britain had 18,001, which was increasingly used around the world. But it wasn't a truly global standard, and needed to be reviewed to make it relevant to contemporary business. So that's the start of 45,001, and it started with probably about 40 nations or so who were going to support it. But by the end, when 45,000 was adopted early this year, there's over 100 nations who've got active interest in supporting it.
Great. So you touched on already the fact there are lots of different national standards, none of which were coordinated. And that was one of the reasons to create 45,001 is to coordinate them. But what kind of problems were people running into with the fact that there was kind of an alphabet soup of standards? And what's the hope that 45,001, like what are the real benefits of having a single consolidated one?
The reservations that there were about having a national standard in your own country, but not being relevant to other countries, is all the standards required different things. They were made parochially for the particular circumstances in whichever country it may be, the US or Australia and New Zealand. And because these were made at different times, they all had a different level of maturity. Through the 1990s and the early 2000s, there was an increasing recognition that we needed to move away from a sort of prevention and a detailed prescriptive approach to one of objective setting. And this standard is really about objective setting. The benefit of objective setting is that there's flexibility and a risk-based approach. The problem with prescription is that if the prescription misses an activity, the activity itself can cause may be a high-risk activity. But if it's not included in the standard, people feel, and organisations will feel that they don't have to do anything to close down that loophole in health and safety. So objective setting is a better way, and setting high-level strategy of gaining in the involvement and commitment of senior management was really something that had been identified in many of the disasters that we are familiar with.
Great, thank you. So that good answer. Yet another move towards risk-based approaches and safety. So if I'm a safety manager, maybe this is entirely new to me. I've never heard this before. Is this is it mandatory to participate in this, or is it optional? And who does it really apply to? Yeah,
the standard international standards are purely voluntary, unless a nation wishes to integrate them in and adopt them as a statutory provision. Now, that had happened with 18,001. It was the law in one particular country, but often they are seen as guidance and as best practice. Generally, what we're saying is they wouldn't become statutory provisions, although it could be referred to in civil and legal proceedings as being a methodology of identifying best practice. The benefits or the particular reasons that the standard was introduced was to accommodate the increasing globalization of business and to make it relevant to modern businesses. This issue of globalization will start transcending national trade barriers, and companies have to work increasingly in different trading blocks. We've got plenty of examples of that in this last year, 2018. So a truly global standard can transcend these trading barriers, because your company, whether you're a multinational company in different places, will be able to work to one standard. Whether your headquarters is in Bermuda and your manufacturing is in the US, and there's another manufacturing plant in China, we can all work to the same standard. So there's a very good economic and trading reason for having this global standard. I think, though, that the standards makers weren't thinking too much about that. They were thinking much more about what I touched on earlier, and that is to increasingly focus on management of health and safety rather than risk prevention by middle managers ensuring that the various protective measures are in place and supervision make sure people wear their PPE. It needed a higher level engagement than that. So also another driver was that other standards, 9001 for quality and 14001 for environment, had increasingly shown that there was a demand for global standards. There are over 1 million organizations certified to 9001, over 300,000 to 14,001. And it made sense that health and safety should run alongside these. And to help that happen was the development of something called Annex SL. So now I'll touch on that later, but those three standards I've mentioned are now integrated management standards, as is 27001 for security. The other thing that the standards makers, there are about 5 or 6 drivers to this. One was the changing patterns of employment, increasing diversification and fragmentation, so that organizations were essentially not as large and as labor intensive as they were in the traditional manufacturing and service industries. The national standards bodies were driving getting unification. Social expectations and corporate governance, those are increasing drivers for business. Their reputation and the environmental considerations and their civil litigation are increasingly both moral, ethical and business drivers to having a better management system. 18,001 and national standards did have these reservations and drawbacks. And the standards makers considered that these fragmented organizations, smaller organizations, still need to manage health and safety, and they needed some flexibility and a guidance level and a code to work to. And so the standards makers have tried to provide that flexibility in the standard. I think, Jeff, that was about 7 or 8 points, all of which were important and affect and impact different organizations in a different way. And probably the listeners and readers will be able to relate to some of those as being important to them.
Good answer. Some things I actually hadn't thought about before. Thank you. One thing you did mention, at least briefly, I believe, is OHSAS 18,001. And I've read some materials from you as well, talking about how this is similar and different, how ISO 45001 is different than OHSAS 18,001. I wondered if you could speak to the difference between those two standards and maybe give some words of wisdom for what people who have been following SAS 18,001, how they should transition, or whether they should transition, or what they should be doing.
Okay. SA 18,001 was originally created in 1996 and then revised in 2007. Let's talk about the reservations and then the advantages of 45,001. Reservations were that it was not a risk-based approach. It was more about being reactive to circumstances. I won't go into the detail of the philosophy, but it was thought to be associated with prevention, which means that there was probably a risk somewhere and you try and reduce the risk or prevent the accident happening. Whereas the philosophy of 45,001 is much more proactive. You look at risks and opportunities, and you try and eliminate the hazard, so that you don't have to prevent anything in the first place. So it's elimination of hazards, and then that's not how the real world works. But nevertheless, 18,001 tended to be reactive. Now this is proposed as a proactive standard. And that's essentially one of the major differences. There's also in 45,001 more emphasis on leadership. Also, 18,001 didn't take into account the context. The context is the working environment, not only locally, but in a macro aspect as well. That's geographic, economic, what's happening in the particular sector that the organization's working in, what the legal position is, and what ways you can improve on what is just purely compliance. So these will mean quite a bit, to no doubt, to some of the readers and listeners, Jeff. And the other key difference to make the 45,001 more flexible was to move away from a documentation and creating a manual and procedures approach to one of a process, more flexibility on documented information. For instance, the documented information can be digital, so a photograph, a recording, data in a digital format is all acceptable in 45,001. It wasn't so easy in 18,000. So those are the key differences, Jeff.
Good answer. I hadn't
now
realized.
Then, what?
Sorry, I stepped on you. Go right ahead.
Go ahead.
Apologies.
Yes, and the other part of the question was, what do we suggest about those who have got 18,001? Well, 18,001 will be withdrawn. Certificates will cease to be issued in March 2021. No, 2021, that's right. So there's a 3-year migration period. Now, any organisation that's gone for 18,001, you would expect will want to go to 45,001. There may be some that want to drop out of the certification route, but not many. So there is a process, and there's some reference that we can show to listeners and readers, Jeff. There is a protocol for transition and migration from 18 to 45,001. That's in the International Association of Federation, International Auditors Federation, IAF. And that step-by-step approach is quite simple in many management terms, is to do a gap analysis, to get a copy of the standard or to know what the requirements are, produce an implementation plan, and deliver on the implementation plan and management review. We can get a reference I'll send you, Jeff, but it's MD 21 of the IAF, requirements for migration to 45,001, MD 21 IAF. And what are 18,001 organisations doing currently? Well, those organisations will be on an audit and certification cycle. It depends on what part of that cycle that they're in now as to what action they will take. But you would think that they will start considering how to start this migration. They should be thinking about that now, even though they may not start the process. I already know, and it's been publicised, that on the day the standard was published, there were, in the UK at least, 10 organisations that were awarded their 45,001 certification. They started the process before the standard came in. That is unusual. Most organisations aren't that precious about getting to the new standard. I think a lot of organisations are just biding their time a bit, because this is a big thing for organisations. They will, like us all, we'll already have our own programs in place, and they can't be, these programs that businesses have, they can't be delivered overnight. They're a long-term project quite often. So trying to add into that process 45,001, which is a significant management change for some, will take some time to, first of all, convince top management that they need to do it, and secondly, start the implementation process.
Okay, good answer. And just a side comment, I was talking with a guy named, you may or may not know him, David Metcalf, who works with Verdantix. They do a lot of work with companies who are
Oh,
looking.
yes.
Yeah, yeah, and he was mentioning a lot of his clients are, in fact, keeping an eye on 45,001 and planning to eventually make that migration or that move as well. Just like you said, even if they haven't jumped into the deep end just yet.
Yes. Well, yeah, I met David in April in Austin. I went to the Intellect's annual jamboree, which was held in Austin, and David was there, and we were introduced. Yeah, so, and you got business relationships as well then, Verdantix, or just in the loop?
Yeah, we work with them, and he was in the States going down the West Coast and was nice enough to stop in our office, and so we got to know each other better that way.
Okay.
Okay, you talked about certification. So we've given a lot of background for 45,001. And I wonder if you could tell us about certification for 45,001, and in particular, if I have it right from you, 3 levels of certification. If you could explain those to the listeners.
Yes, there are 3 methodologies of an organization adopting and declaring that they're working to the standard. I put it that way. And these are 3 levels of verification, and they go from a level 1 through to level 2 and level 3. Level 3 is certification, and that is where an organization will be registered by a certification body, and that registration is the declaration and the certificate that they can show that they conform to a standard, and this standard in particular. So that's a level 3 certification level, and it's sometimes known as registration, sometimes known as certification, depending which country you're in. However, there are 2 levels below that. Let's say below that, level 1 and level 2. And with level 1 verification, you can self-declare, self-verify adherence to this and compliance to this standard by going through a process of internal audit. And if the audit is done thoroughly and acceptably to the organization, they can declare that they work to it. And I think that's probably quite a big plus particularly for smaller organizations, or for those organizations who don't want to go down the certification route, because that's more expensive because of you're employing outside people, and not to say that the rigor is any greater, but it is others in the loop with your implementation. So with level 1 verification, it can be an internal audit, or you can employ an external auditor to go through the process with you. In either case, it isn't registered or certified. Level 2 is where a second party or an outside body will audit your system, and it's often a client or a customer. So a supplier may audit their client, or a specification from one of the organization's clients may require the supply organization to conform to 45,001. And this is quite often the pressure from outside that pushes organizations to conform. So this is a third-party audit by an external organization who may be a supplier or in the supply chain. or a client who organises the parent organisation, who audits that organisation. Now, there's no certificate or no accredited body certification, but quite often you see these supply chain quality systems who are developed by quite often large organisations, and they will then declare that all their suppliers conform to their commercial or their corporate system, and that is increasingly important in the global market. You can see the pressures, particularly when you've got extended supply chains, global supply chains. It gives some assurance, both from a business point of view and also from an ethical point of view, that the supply chain is conforming to the standards, workplace standards, which are very much in the news about, we call it over here in the UK slave labour, or poor working conditions in some of the developing countries. So the 45,001 will have an application, quite a significant application. Just as an aside, Jeff, if we remember the plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh, where many clothing manufacturers had their articles manufactured. Since that happened, there's over 200 of the clients of those. Yes, 200 of the suppliers are. Sure thing. Righto. It's 200. What's the point of supply, Jeff? What's the point of supply? Yeah, over 200 clothing outlets organisations have now reached an agreement together that any supply from any developing countries or elsewhere would have to meet minimum standards of employment, welfare and safety of the manufacturing organisation. And that was as a result of that plaza collapse. And again, here's 45,001 ready to fill that gap, so that there's a global standard that these organizations can work to.
Gotcha. That's nice to have terrible tragedy, but nice to have a concrete example of how this can fill a need.
Yeah, and I was short of the word, which I think is the Rani Plaza. I'm getting it for you, Jeff. Rana Plaza, RANAPLAZA in 2013. That was it.
Thank you. And for those who are listening or reading this, after Chris and I have this webinar, cases like that, or even we're talking about certain quality standards or something, I'll make sure to put links into the article that accompanies this video. One last specific question for you, Chris, something you've hinted at, addressed a little bit. If you can give us a little more detail about this, and this will be our last specific question for this first of the two webinars that you and I will be having. You mentioned that ISO 45001 is similar to some ISO standards on quality, on environmental protection, and I didn't know also security. That was new to me, and I wondered if you could just kind of explain how the new ISO 45001 standard is similar to those other standards, and what the benefits are of having all those be similar. Okay.
Yes, there are. You've mentioned 4 integrated management standards, Jeff, and there is another one on 22,000. I think it's on business continuity. They all are framed on a structure known as Annex SL, and that is a system where all those standards have the same clause headings. There are 10 clauses, and each of those standards has the same headings, and to quite a significant extent, the wording of the clauses are the same. What is different is the specificity within those clauses. 9,000 quality, 14,000 environment, 27,000 security. So Annex SL provides that commonality. And because we're looking at some of the advantages now, because of that commonality, you can see the business case for reducing duplication, but also reducing the intellectual effort that goes into trying to understand what each standard is trying to achieve. So some of the advantages. So if you've got an organization already adopting 9001, for instance, and there is 1 million of them, you can see that they will also have to deal with environment without a doubt, and health and safety will come into their remit as well. So you can see the advantages of them looking at these other management standards, because it'll reduce duplication. Quite often, each standard will have its own specialist, doesn't it? That's how the business operates. There'll be a specialist for nut quality, a specialist for environment, and so on. And they may even have their own particular processes and procedures, which again separate. It's this funnel and chimney approach that you can help break down by using an integrated management standard. But I think the key benefit is that each of these standards needs top management to engage. Each standard is bidding for integrating the particular process into other business processes, so that you get the top management team perhaps working together with a common aim, rather than quite often what happens with organizations is that each of these top managers are competing with their own particular disciplines. Here is a good way of getting them all together to go for a common aim of health and safety, in particular, environment and quality. So you're going to reduce duplication, Jeff. You will also have the flexibility of people within the organization being able to understand what their common purpose is. Quite often with this duplication of processes, shall we say, the workers at the point of delivery have these conflicting aims of, okay, so we've got something going on wrong with this machine or service today. Which is important to us, the quality, the environment, or is it health and safety? Which one are we going to sacrifice? And there are mixed messages coming down. So the move towards integration will help that. It's not in the first instance or the first understanding of the standards, that's the sort of benefits that you may gain from this. We can talk about some of the differences between those who've got 9,000 and 45, and the difference to 45. We can talk about some of the differences between 14 and 45. Certainly, the areas where they will be different is the policies of each of those three disciplines will be different. So this is the detail of what their aims and objectives are. One of the common approaches to all three standards is risk. I think in 45,001, there's a lot more depth to risk here. It's not just about risk to the management system or risk to the business. It's health and safety risk. It's risk to individuals as well. So that part of 45,001 is much more advanced and focused than 9,000 or 14,000. And one of the other things is that each standard will be thinking about is what their compliance obligations are. So quality have got some specific requirements in there, no doubt in relation to the sector. Environment is much more about a global aspect to the environmental compliance obligations, and yet there will be individual country obligations as well. And I think the drive with health and safety compliance obligations are that you're going to aim to exceed what the statutory requirements are in each country, and you aim for best practice, and that is the progressive nature of 45001. No doubt those with 9014 will all argue the same as well, but certainly I think the minimum standards that the statutory requirements require in some countries is quite low, and even in advanced countries we've still got these gaps that we mentioned earlier within the national standards because of their prescriptive approach. Okay, Jeff?
Yeah, that's a good answer. And those are that's the end of the questions I have for you for this interview. This is we thought of this as a way to introduce people to 45001. So task done for people listening to this interview or reading it once I've typed it up. Chris has been nice enough to agree to come back and do a second interview, and that's going to be about how to implement. He has some tips for implementing 45001. So we look forward to that. That'll be really valuable. We thank Chris for that. Chris, before we take off, so I mentioned you're working on some materials. You told me this that would help people get to know 45001 better than that. You're going to have them on a website at some point soon. So again, people listening know that we'll get those links to you and get you a way to get those materials. Between now and then, Chris, are there ways for people that you'd recommend people to learn more about 45001 and or to get in touch with you to learn more about 45001?
Sure, Jeff. We have a website, imsglobalstandards.com, and there's a lot of free information, downloads, and background information in that. And we've got one or two commercial products as well, a guidance to the standard, and we have an implementation package as well. And these products have been produced by those who've helped draft the standard as well, so it is expertise. So people are welcome to come along, and we've talked about we're developing other products as well. And so by the time, Jeff, that this information goes out, there will be plenty for people to look at there. And I look forward to the next webinar, Jeff. One of the things that I was going through my mind about organizations is to categorize them into A, B, and C listing organization, A, B, and C listers. So we can talk about that a little bit more. Who are the A listers and who are the C listers? And who are the also RANs that are just not going to, this is not going to be for them at all.
All right, great. Well, I look forward to that. So before we close down, I want to, first of all, thank you for your time. I came in thinking I knew the stuff we were going to talk about, and I learned things I had no idea about today. So thank you very much for that. I want to thank you for your work you've done on the standard, which is appreciated. And I've been working on American National Standard, ANSI, ASSE, Z490.2 about online safety training. So I know it's not easy. I can't imagine what your job was like. So thank you for that. And I also want to call out and thank you. And this is a way for people to keep in touch with Chris and follow Chris. Chris, you did mention you have a LinkedIn group on the ISO 45001 standard. You do a lot of work sharing information and did a lot of work throughout the development of that. And that was one of the two best sources I found for keeping up to date with 45001. I caught a good seminar at a ASSE national conference, and then your LinkedIn group, where those are my two primary sites. So thank you very much for that, and I recommend people check that out. And again, that LinkedIn group helped me as well for my work on ANSI. So I've kind of been not only learning from you, but copying you. So I just want to say thank you very much, and I hope everyone does stay tuned for the second webinar about implementing 45001.